Detectives stood over the remains of two teenage girls, Sheila Swanson and Melissa Sanders. Both had been bound and brutally murdered. They weren't the first. There had been more missing girls, more decomposing bodies, abductions, hikers vanishing. Then there was the case that shocked everyone, a vicious axe attack involving two young female students. And it had all been happening off the same road. Highway 20 stretched out over 450 miles, a long isolated road dotted with poor logging towns and flanked by endless dense forest. It was scenic in parts, desolate in others. When the mist moved in, everything was swallowed whole. It was the ideal hunting ground for a monster searching for prey. In 1992, two teenagers, Melissa, 17, and Sheila, 19, were drifting. Like many kids from the small town scattered along Highway 20, they were struggling to find purpose. There were no jobs, not much hope, and they'd started falling in with the wrong crowd. Like everyone else, they just wanted out. The girls never had much money, and after dropping out of high school, the future didn't look bright. The highlight of their days was hanging out with friends at the local Sherry's restaurant. It's where the girls first met the state highway mechanic, John Ackroyd, a man far too old to be keeping company with teenagers. And to detectives who'd been watching him for years, he was the last person who should have been befriending young women. Little did anyone know, he had already started his path of terror. Late in May, the girls went camping with Melissa's parents at Beverly Beach State Park in Oregon. The place did nothing for them. Bored and restless, they just wanted to get back to their boyfriends. Using a payphone, they tried to arrange a ride, but Melissa's place in Sweet Home was an hour and a half away, too far for anyone to make the trip. So the girls decided to hitchhike back. We'll get to what happened next, but first, this is our new channel for all things true crime. If you want us to cover more cases like this, please hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making videos like this. And let us know in the comments what you want us to cover next. Now back to what happened to Melissa and Sheila. Melissa's parents woke early the next morning and were met by an empty tent. The girls were gone. They assumed they had gotten bored and called someone to pick them up. But when the family returned to Sweet Home a few days later, there was no sign of Melissa. Her father searched for her and called her friends. Strangely, no one had seen her. With panic growing, he reported her missing. Sheila from nearby Lebanon didn't return home either. Her family were frantic. Soon, the girls' faces were on missing posters in every local town. The net was closing, but too slowly. Had a man named Marvin Laurent seen those posters, he might have had cause for concern. On the day the girls went missing, he had been starting the graveyard shift at the state highway shop in Sweet Home. One of the state mechanics pulled up in his rig. Laurent knew the man always dropped it off before heading to his truck, but he never had seen him arrive this late at night. It was John Ackroyd, and he had dried blood all over his hands and arms. Most guys hunted in this part of the USA, but it wasn't normal to be walking around covered in blood. "Hit a deer," said Ackroyd when he saw the shock on Laurent's face. "I had to gut it out." Even stranger, he told Laurent after gutting it, he threw it into the brush. It didn't make any sense. John washed up, got in his truck, and drove away. Something wasn't right, and Laurent knew it. About 5 months later, Laurent was listening to the radio when he heard the news. The bodies of the two missing girls had been found by hunters. They had been murdered, and their bodies were bound and naked. And his mind went back to that night. The bodies were too decomposed to determine the exact cause of death. The report said the police had found a rivet next to the body of Sheila, something often used by mechanics doing field repairs. They suspected it might have dropped out of the pocket of the killer. Laurent couldn't stop thinking about it. John Ackroyd, the blood, the unlikely story of gutting a deer in the road, and then just throwing it into the forest. And the rivet. What kind of man would be carrying a rivet? Laurent was right to be suspicious. In 1977, 20-year-old Marlene Gabrielson was a single mother in Lebanon, a town about 14 miles away from Sweet Home. She had barely left the house since she had given birth to a girl 3 months earlier. It was time for a night out. She and her husband decided that they'd get a babysitter and head over to the Sisters Rodeo with friends. They drove about 90 miles into the dense expanse of forest, setting up camp with friends and sitting around a fire drinking beer. Marlene didn't like to be away from her baby. Tension flared when she started arguing with her husband. He wanted to go off with some friends, and that is exactly what he did. Marlene told the others at the campsite she wanted to head back to her baby. But it was after midnight. They were virtually in the middle of nowhere. To make it worse, she was already drunk. So when a man told her that he was also going to go back to town, and he had a friend who would take her too, she was delighted. Soon, she was sitting in a truck's front bench seat squeezed in between the man and the driver. The driver barely said a word, and he smelled of stale sweat. but Marlene was just happy to have a ride. The other man got out after a few miles. Marlene noticed there were no door handles on the passenger side. Strange. Her head was still dizzy from the beer, but she was sober enough to see the large hunter's knife sitting in an old coffee tin next to the driver's seat. Turning around, she spotted a .22 caliber rifle in a rack. Calm down, she told herself, before drifting off to sleep. The driver was John Ackroyd. She woke to his hands around her ankles as he violently pulled her out of the cab, her head bashing against the doorframe. "You're going to do what I tell you," he growled as he pushed the knife up to her neck. Later, he just stood there staring at her as she cried in the undergrowth. "I'm not sure what to do with you," he said in a calm voice, pondering. "You could take me home," she whined. Enjoying the power he had over her, he paused and then said, "I'm not sure I want to do that." Not for a million years did Marlene want to get back into that truck, but so far from home, she didn't want to be left alone, so she tried to convince him that she liked him, and somehow it worked. He drove her back, stopping off at his house in Sweet Home. After asking for his phone number, she wrote it down on the back of a packet of cigarettes, evidence for the police. "Maybe we can see each other again," he asked before he dropped her off in Lebanon at the house of her mother-in-law. The door opened to what happened. Marlene, half-clad, dirty, hair all over the place, told her, "Call the police." This should have been the end of Ackroyd, but it wasn't. The police took his side. They believed him that Marlene had seduced him, that she had ripped her jeans, pulling them off in excitement, bruising herself, scratching herself on the forest floor. "She was wasted," said the other guy who shared the truck. He told the cops that he knew Ackroyd well, he wouldn't hurt a fly. The district attorney refused to prosecute. The only punishment Ackroyd received was a beating from Marlene's husband. But Marlene's story wasn't over. Almost 2 years later, there was a knock on her door. 2 detectives had seen the files, and they knew the original officers had almost certainly failed her. The physical evidence alone should have been enough to put John before a jury. But they weren't there to reopen her case. A young woman had just been murdered. Her body had been found on an isolated stretch of road off of Highway 20, just 30 minutes from where Marlene had been attacked. The police had a suspect. It was John Ackroyd. It was Christmas Eve, 1978, about a year and a half since Marlene's attack. 35-year-old Kaye Turner was getting into her running shoes for a winter jog near Camp Sherman, about 55 miles from Sweet Home. The roads were flanked with snowbanks as she left her husband Noel early that morning at the campsite, where they and some friends were vacationing from Eugene. Kaye had run a marathon earlier that year. Running had become an obsession in her friendship group, though no one else wanted to join her. She said that she wasn't going far, only about 8 miles, just an hour or so. But an hour had passed, and then another and another. Day turned to evening, and she still hadn't returned. Kaye was a manager at a local public health agency back in Eugene. Smart, responsible, and far too careful to get lost or stay out knowing that Noel would be waiting for her. Noel and the others searched the roads about 5 miles around the campsite, but they found nothing. Frustrated and worried, they called the police. Detective Clayton Dewar of the Oregon State Police and 2 detectives drove over to Camp Sherman to interview people and ask if they had seen a jogger out on the roads. A man named Thomas Hanna came forward. He had been heading home after a night shift as a highway worker when he passed her. He told the detectives that another highway worker had also driven by, 29-year-old John Ackroyd. This was a bad time for a missing persons case. The locals had been on edge now for well over a year. In June 1977, 2 young women, both Yale students, had been attacked at Cline Falls State Park, about an hour southeast of Camp Sherman. Like something from a campsite horror story, they had instinctively known all day someone had been watching them from the trees. Just before midnight, they were in their tent, trying to sleep, when they heard the sound of a truck. Before they could even move, the engine revved and the truck drove right over their tent, pinning one of the girls under the tire. Her bones smashed, her lungs crushed. The other girl looked up and saw a dark, towering figure with an axe in his hand. She begged for her life as he hacked at her head 6 times, causing severe brain damage. For a reason the girls never understood, he allowed them to live. He just got into his truck and drove away. He was still on the loose when Kaye had gone missing. So when detectives heard the name John Ackroyd again, he became a possible suspect in both cases. They started digging into his past, and soon a story emerged of an unhinged man. In school, he had no friends, a loner. He was bullied, listed as special education. One of the locals who had known him back then recalled how he had once seen John take an axe to a litter of puppies. The same guy said John would happily shoot squirrels and cut off their tails. After flunking out of school and getting involved in petty crime, He joined the army, serving as a mechanic in Korea, then Thailand, and then Germany. But his criminal behavior followed him. He was caught selling weed, and then he went AWOL. After that, he was caught trying to sell army supplies. Every step of his life seemed to lead toward crime, and no one stopped him. After his short-lived military career, John returned to the towns of his childhood. Police knew he had seen Kaye. His workplace in Santiam Junction was only about a 20-minute drive from Camp Sherman. On January 11th, detectives asked him about that morning on Christmas Eve. He told them he had clocked off from his night shift at 6:30 a.m. Instead of going home, he'd gone over to Camp Sherman to hunt coyotes. And yes, he said he had seen a runner fitting the description of Kaye. But for now, he remained a person of interest. Police were more interested in Kaye's husband. Kaye had been living a secret life. Detectives discovered she was having 2 extramarital relationships. Maybe Noel had killed her in a fit of rage. Despite the Christmas gifts that he had hidden in the trunk of their car, they hadn't been getting on. Then there were her 2 boyfriends, both married men. Not only was Noel a suspect, but so were the other 2 men and their wives. Detectives were so sure that this was the reason for her disappearance that they developed tunnel vision, barely even conducting searches of the local forest. Trackers soon found a pair of footprints at the side of the road, perfectly preserved in the ice. They came from small Nike running shoes. Next to them were prints from work boots. It looked as if whoever wore the boots had scuffled with the person in the running shoes and then dragged them across the ground. But it wasn't enough for the detectives to pursue it much further. Then, about 8 months later, there was a major break, something no one expected. Camp Sherman had a small local grocery store, the kind of place where the owners knew all the locals by name. The shopkeeper, Christine Weston, certainly knew John Ackroyd. He went in often. But one time, his odd behavior left an impression on her. A few months later, John went into the store again and walked right up to her. But what he had to say bowled her over completely. He'd claimed that he had just been out hunting rabbits with his dog, and he'd come across the body of the missing jogger. Looking shocked, or at least pretending, he told Christine he was nervous. After all, he had been the last person to see Kaye alive, and now he was the first person to find her remains. Why did I have to find her? Ackroyd was inserting himself into the investigation. But why? Kaye's body was by then just bones and cloth, but Ackroyd seemed to know it was a woman. Not just any woman, but Kaye. She was lying just half a mile from where she'd gone missing. Detectives, now regretting that they hadn't conducted a serious search, soon found her yellow shorts, her blue pullover, and one of her Nike running shoes, as well as a part of another. In a tree above, the birds had used strands of her blonde hair with twigs to build their nest. Her gold-colored Timex watch was there, likely broken when she was fighting for her life. The time read December 24th, 9:27 a.m., just over an hour since she had said goodbye to Noel. Ackroyd was now the prime suspect. He kept changing his story. At first he had just driven past her, then it became that he had stopped, and later he had stopped and even talked to her. And then he changed his story again. He had told them he actually had found Kaye's body months earlier but decided not to tell the police. She was much less decomposed then. He could see her throat had been slashed and that she had been shot in the breast area, and he even touched her remains. He claimed the reason he hadn't told the police is that he'd been worried they would finger him for the murder. For the detectives, it was possibly a case of a killer returning to the scene of the crime, something serial killers often do to relive an experience. But the story changed again. Ackroyd said that when he had talked to Kaye that morning, he hadn't been alone. As God was his witness, he'd been with his hunting buddy Roger Dale Beck, both of them out looking for coyotes. In a voluntary interview, Beck admitted that he was there, although both men later changed their story and said that they had been illegally poaching deer, so had been worried about coming forward to the police. Ackroyd was either smarter than he seemed or very stupid. Was he placing himself at the scene of the murder to confuse detectives, playing dumb, a kind of I know how this must look detective? Or was he just a simple man with a simple mind who should have known better than to lie to the police? There was no physical evidence linking him to the murder. The body was too decomposed. They believed he had done it, especially after he failed a polygraph, but they had nothing to hold him with. As the years passed, Ackroyd melted back into his environment. He continued to work for the state, fixing broken-down vehicles, and always moving along those lost highways. In the mid-'80s, he married a woman, Linda. She had 2 young kids, Byron and Rachanda, both in junior high school. John was about to step into the shoes of a stepfather. On the outside, he appeared to be a decent man. He was putting bread on the table in a family that had experienced years of poverty, taking the kids out for pizza, going bowling and hunting. But inside of the house, things were very different. He beat the kids for the smallest transgressions, not just slaps, but black eyes, busted lips, welts from beltings. Linda had a string of relationships with bad men, drunks, thieves, and jobless drug users, so when John came along, former military with a stable job, she thought that her luck had changed. At first, that's exactly how it seemed. Byron and Rachanda thought he was great at the start, but after the marriage, the beating started. His temper was like nothing they had seen. They were good kids, never in trouble. They didn't steal or smoke or take drugs. Rachanda always helped her mom around the house. She was full of energy, always laughing, always playing on her bicycle when she wasn't in her bedroom. But when John became her stepdad, she transformed. Her joyful energy was gone. Her smile disappeared. Rachanda's teachers at her sweet home school couldn't believe how much she had changed. They'd always felt sorry for her. No one ever attended her parent-teacher meetings, but Rachanda had never seemed to let this get her down. She was almost always in a good mood. Then she started turning up for school with dread on her face. When the bell rang at the end of the day, she'd sit in the classroom alone, saying that she didn't want to go home. She confided in some friends that she was petrified of John, often pleading with them to sleep over at their place. No one knew the horror Rachanda faced at home, but it was about to get worse. It was July 1990. Rachanda woke up and, as usual, she helped Linda get ready, braiding her hair. She was watching cartoons as Linda and John ate breakfast and then headed out to their jobs. John was still a highway mechanic and her mom was a housekeeper at a resort community. There was no school that day, so Rachanda's only job was doing some household chores. She had to vacuum the house, take the hot dogs out of the freezer to thaw, and load the dirty plates into the dishwasher. She was about to start when something unexpected happened. John came back. Her heart probably sank. It was the last time anyone saw Rachanda again. John told the police he had dropped Linda off at work on Highway 20 and gone to fix snowplows. The parts weren't there yet, so he went home. His supervisor later told the police that there was a stack of work that day for John to do. John said he'd walked through the door and Rachanda was asleep on the couch. He claimed that when she woke, he offered to take her out to photograph deer, but Rachanda declined. She had too many chores to do. And that was it. John left. When he came back about 2 hours later, she was gone. Did he look for her? No, but he did pick Linda up after she finished work. Linda was mad when she returned home. Rachanda hadn't done any of her chores. She presumed Rachanda was playing out with friends, but it was strange she hadn't left a note like she usually did. Even stranger, after dinner, Linda and John had sex. Their sex life had been barren for years, but something had changed that day. It was great, John later told detectives, seemingly forgetting the conversation was about his missing daughter. Evening fell. There was still no sign of Rachanda. The next morning, Linda called 911. When the dispatcher asked her who had last seen her daughter, her reply was clear: stepdad, John Ackroyd. Now his name was connected to another murder. 11 years had passed since someone had killed Kaye Turner, but there had been other missing women cases, and there had been those two Yale girls. The district attorney, Bill Hanlon, pored over John's file. There was no way this guy was clean. The next day, he and a deputy went over to John's house. John was outside painting the tailgate of his Ford pickup. He didn't seem the least bit concerned that his stepdaughter was missing. He knew her weight, her height, when she was born, even her bra size. When police later showed him some pants they'd found in the woods, possibly Rachanda's, they noticed he seemed excited. He was the prime suspect, but without a body, there wasn't much the detectives could do. Ackroyd seemed untouchable, at least for now. Months passed and there was a crash out on one of the forest roads. A total wreck, a car with a semi, a dead woman in the front seat. And as a highway worker, John was called out. The detective who met him, who had studied his file, asked him to help him remove the woman's body, all mangled and bloodied. It was a test. Most men would wince, some would even cry, but John seemed to enjoy it. And then he said something disturbing. As he impassively held her dead body in his arms, he said it weighed about the same as his missing stepdaughter, about 87 pounds. It was the same when he was interviewed about Rachanda at the station. Sounding completely unemotional, he explained to the detectives that an attractive girl like her would be easy prey for an abductor. No problem, he said, quote, "You could punch them and they'd just crumple. They got no fight in them." This was the same man the detectives were told would watch a VHS tape of Friday the 13th and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and he'd get excited pausing and rewinding the scenes where someone got hacked to death. His friends were so disturbed that they left. In the many hours of interviews over the years, John once told the police that's probably what happened to his daughter, that she had met a man in the woods like Jason Voorhees. He was being serious too. When they pressed harder, he grew defensive. Without a body, there was little they could do about Rachanda, and Kaye, her case was still wide open. Years had passed, detectives retired, more girls went missing. Everything changed when Detective Will McAnulty got on the case in 1992. He was a rookie, but with fresh eyes on the files, he caught what others had missed. He focused not on John, but on Roger Dale Beck. Beck had served some time and then moved to California. His wife, Pam, knew John well. Years earlier, she had fallen in love with him and tattooed his name on her arm, but she had married Beck. McAnulty drove 750 miles to interview her. Surely those guys had said something incriminating over all those years. They had. They'd told her to lie to the police, and she freely admitted to McAnulty she had lied like hell. They told her they had gone out poaching deer that Christmas Eve. They had come back covered in blood. They claimed they had seen Kaye and mistaken her for an animal. They opened fire, killing her. Pam had kept it to herself. She told McAnulty more, that Beck would get drunk and tell her he and John had actually assaulted Kaye. If she and Beck argued, he would threaten her, saying that if you don't shut up, I'll do what me and John did to Kaye Turner. The web of violence and lies was finally unraveling. After Rachanda went missing, Linda had thrown him out. He went to live with his mother. He still had his mechanic job, still driving on the deserted roads. Around the time McAnulty was investigating him, he was driving with the teenage daughter of one of his friends when she asked him to stop for two of her friends on the road. It looked like they needed a ride. Their names were Melissa Sanders and Sheila Swanson. They remembered they'd actually met John before at the restaurant in Lebanon. Great, they could now get back to their boyfriends. They were never seen alive again. The police were about to swoop in on John for the murder of Kaye. Panicked, he emptied a storage unit he'd been renting. By the time police got there, everything was gone. But they already had enough to put him before a grand jury. He was soon behind bars at the Jefferson County Jail. Melissa and Sheila had been missing for just a few weeks. Had he known that he was about to get caught and desperate, addicted to killing, he committed one last crime? Police couldn't be sure it was him. The two girls had been hanging out with men with histories of violence, and detectives now knew that a few weeks before they went missing, Melissa had gotten herself into serious trouble after stealing some apparatus from a local meth lab. Violent meth dealers aside, John was a prime suspect. At least 5 other teenage girls had vanished from the county between 1984 and 1995, and John fit the bill for all of them. The list of victims kept growing, and so did the urgency to stop him. In 1993, he was convicted of the murder of Kaye. Beck went down too. But it wasn't over. They interviewed John time and time again, but it wasn't until the early 2010s that detectives reopened the case of the missing girls on Highway 20. They went through thousands of files, connecting the old dots. The more they looked, the more they agreed John might have killed many more girls than was first thought, including Melissa and Sheila. There was also the Jane Doe found in 1976 on Swamp Mountain Road. Many years later, her remains were identified with genetic genealogy. Jane Doe became Marion Vinetta Nagel McCorder. She was 21 when she went missing while hitchhiking. Her aunt told the cops the last time Marion had called her, she said a man had offered to give her a ride close to Highway 20. And there was Rodney Lynn Grissom and his girlfriend Karen Jean Lee. Last seen in 1977 near Highway 20, they were trying to hitchhike to California. The last anyone heard from them was Karen calling from a payphone in Lebanon. "Our ride is here, I have to go." Their bodies have never been found. But police later discovered Rodney's watch. Close by were Karen's trousers, her blouse, a notebook, and a pair of jeans that looked as though someone had cut them with a knife. Detectives knew for sure that John would trawl Highway 20 looking for victims, and Jane Morris was proof. When she was 24, a few months before Kaye died, she had just clocked off from her restaurant job near Camp Sherman. Riding her bicycle, John saw her and revved the engine, trailing her down the road until he caught up. Pulling out a handgun and pointing it at her, he screamed for her to stop. Shaking, she just kept going. Decades later, she pointed back. "Yes, that's him," she told a court full of people. That was about a year after the attack on those 2 Yale girls, but years later, they couldn't make an ID. One had a serious brain injury and the other had only seen a large silhouette coming at her with an axe. Elizabeth Musler was just 22 after she went missing from near Lebanon. Her body was found in a shallow grave just off Highway 20 in 1977. A year later, another girl was found, name unknown, the Linn County Jane Doe. Then, another was found that same year, the Finley Creek Jane Doe. Maybe there were more killers than John in those desolate areas, or maybe they were all his, including Wanda Ann Herr, just 19, killed and dumped in the late 70s. No one even reported her missing. Her partial skull was found in 1986, but she wasn't identified until 2017. Detectives questioned John many times in his cell at Oregon State Penitentiary. He was now very unhealthy and walked with a cane. With almost $3,600 a month in pensions, he spent all of his cash on cheap processed food from the commissary. Struggling to breathe, he'd tell the detectives, "I have never killed anybody in my life." It was denial after denial. But in 2013, after detectives had compiled a strong case, John pleaded no contest to the murder of Rachanda. He neither confessed nor denied, but accepted he would never seek bail. There was still her body, still her mom and her brother. They wanted closure. They wanted to give her a burial. In 2016, detectives closed the case on Melissa and Sheila. John had murdered them, there was no doubt, but he was already going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. It wasn't worth the cost of a prosecution. It was December, just after Christmas, John's hunting season. He had so much more to tell and so many more secrets. But at the age of 67 in his cell that night, he collapsed and died from heart disease. He was found next to his false teeth on the floor. His sleep apnea machine still connected to his throat. The truth about the ghosts of Highway 20 also died that night. And don't forget to subscribe if you'd like us to cover more cases like this. Make sure to like the video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments who we should cover next.